Oh look, you found me. I guess that means we're gonna be making something today. Well, okay, I guess we're not really making something today, but what we're doing is we're going to be discussing what goes into how to create character design. I decided to embark on this arduous journey over the weekend, and I watched a bunch of videos to start. I was like, okay, I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna do this right. I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna learn and I'm gonna educate myself, because I love drawing, but something I feel like I've always seriously lacked is the ability to design interesting or compelling characters. For the most part, my characters are pretty copy-paste, and I've gotten to this point in my life where I only seem to draw gesture drawings, and I'm like, cool, alright, so what's the next step? How do I take the skills that I've developed and enter that next phase? Enter YouTube, which is one of my favorite places, if you can't tell. So, after watching several videos and spending the majority of an afternoon just learning and reading and researching and digging through comments, all of the fun stuff, here are the major takeaways that I found in most of the videos about character design on YouTube. Honestly, they can be broken down into 6 categories. The first one being shape. So with shape, they're indicating that the shape of the character will influence the way that we perceive them. So more rounded characters will have a more approachable personality, generally more well-rounded, kinder, softer characters, things like that. Characters with box shapes will typically have more of a sturdy personality. They're very stable, they're not rigid. They can be a little stubborn, things like that. And then, you have your triangular shapes. So with the triangular shape, typically those are associated with characters that have a bit more of a wild disposition, because that sharp, angular shape can turn and curve at any moment. So knowing this, one of the videos that I found that played around with the idea of shape the best, and that I happen to like the most, was from Draw Sessions, and it was a doodling exercise. So the concept was that at the beginning we were going to start and do 10 doodles, and it was one of those things, don't take it seriously, just whatever comes out, comes out. For people who are beginning, this is a little intimidating, because again, you're still sitting there trying to understand how to apply the structure of just doodling, but also to just don't overthink it. Because in his video, one of the things that I like the best is his approach. He literally started by just doodling one little thing, and his very first doodle was relatively small, was not very complex, it was basic shape, just to the point where we could actually kind of start to tell what it was. And then he would move on to the next one, and then the next one, and then by the time he got to the 10th one, that one was already pretty well fleshed out. So then he decided and picked one and took that particular doodle and just added to it. We elaborated it, we cleaned it up, things like that. So I liked that exercise because it gives a bit more fluidity to what you're trying to do. Category number 2 would be the concept of studying, which I get it. Studying and referencing and practice and observation, it's all important. Knowing how to do these things will help you design characters, but it's more of a concept of okay, I know how to do these things, I've done these things, I'm familiar with drawing shapes and active angles and things like that. So even though it wasn't my favorite video, because it doesn't really tell you how to start taking those concepts and applying them, it was by BAM Animation, and they give you 15 different exercises that you can work on to improve your character design. Now, again, while I can appreciate it, part of my problem personally is that I'm trying to learn how to take the practices I've already been doing and use what I have in order to start designing more interesting characters. So, it's one of those things. Telling me how to draw lines doesn't feel like it's helping. Like, I can sit there and draw lines, but it's learning how to apply those lines to a character. I don't know. I don't know if this makes any sense. Has anybody else had trouble with this? Is anybody else struggling with this? Is it just me? I don't know. But so I didn't find the video exceedingly helpful in terms of character design, although the studies that they reference and that they give you are good studies for any artist to be practicing. Concept number 3 was the idea of silhouettes. Silhouettes are not my favorite way to approach character design, because while some characters do have very unique silhouettes, there have also been good character designs where their silhouette hasn't been entirely captivating. I'm not saying that it's just a block, but I don't know, like, I suppose maybe I just see it a little bit differently. For example, if you take a silhouette like Kirby's, it's very identifiable, sure, but is it the best character design? I feel like that's not very fair to say, because essentially he's just a grouping of circular shapes. So I don't know. Like, I like Kirby's design, but especially when you're trying to learn how to make good character design, I don't know, maybe I'm just struggling with it, because I can see the point and the purpose of it. The silhouette is an easy and immediate way for us to understand and convey information visually about a character, which is the whole point of character design. You want to design a character where their physical features immediately spark some kind of information and communication with the viewer. So, I don't know. But the video that I referenced for this is by Mira. I think I'm butchering it. I'm sure it's Viyaura. Anyway, but she gives 3 main points on designing better characters. The first one being the world building, the world that your character exists in, making sure that it's appropriate for the character that you're designing. So, for example, if you are focusing on a world where it's magicians and magic and mages and knights and dragons, you wouldn't want cyberpunk to cross over with that. Not unless that's the stylistic choice that you're making, which, might be interesting. But, the point is making sure that your character's design is appropriate for the world. So again, like, if you're talking about medieval type things, would they have a gun? What would that gun look like if they did? Would it be realistic? Is it something that, honestly fits in with the storyline? Just things to consider about that nature. And then the second point was the name of the character. Which, I get it. I don't know. Probably like most other artists, I'm not the greatest at naming things. So, I don't know. At that particular point, I understood it. It just didn't really super help because, again, application versus like knowledge of, like, I can understand that having a good name helps a character feel a little more real, but at the same time it's like I'm trying to actually apply practices to drawing an interesting character. And then the final point again was the silhouettes and the color, which color is an important topic, and she talked about it a little bit, but mostly it was the concept of a silhouette. Honestly, though, someone who did talk about color quite a bit, and I actually really enjoyed his video, not gonna lie, love his style too. Like, the way that he draws his characters is just great, like, because his style really shines through, and also his character design is really great. But his name is Fruity Yumi, and he had 2 videos that I watched. They were both about character design, and actually the one point that I was talking about a minute ago, like visual perspective. He talks about that a lot in the second part, and then in the first part he's talking a lot about basically like color theory. He talks about shape and things like that too, and then he also discusses body language, which is really important because, again, the way that your character stands or is represented and the way that they move, that will drastically impact the way that they're perceived. So especially, he talks a lot about like coloring and things like that, and I just really like the way that he broke that down, because essentially he talks about negative space and positive space, and then also he ends up talking a lot about like just the shades of color and how that can impact the way that we see characters. Definitely recommend his video for character design. So those are 2 points kind of wrapped up into one, because color and body language. But then also there is a tiny little side note, and I think something I genuinely struggle with, because I mentioned it earlier, but gesture drawing is basically what I've learned how to do, and it's not very practical for applying, actual character design, especially when you start considering costumes, clothing, accessories, things like that. It feels like that's a whole nother step that you eventually will have to take, because I absolutely struggle with the idea of drawing clothes on characters. I don't know if I just don't have a very creative vision when it comes to clothing in general. It's definitely an avenue I am aiming to start dabbling with and playing with, but there's that concept of, like, I just always draw my characters in t-shirt and jeans because it's the easiest thing I know how to draw, and I don't know how to draw other more interesting things. So, on top of trying to learn character design, I'm also trying to learn how to draw clothing on top of a character, which really sucks. It's really hard. That tiny little side note, like aside, a last point that I actually have is about proportions. And the video that I watched that I actually really liked that went over this topic was by QR Bits, and I loved her video. It was the third part. It was pretty lengthy, so I didn't watch the first and second parts. I do plan on going back and watching those, but basically what she was explaining in this video was breaking down the different aspects of character design in terms of like the visual representation. The concept of, she had a grid of characters ranging from very cartoony to very realistic, and she kind of like broke down like how the proportions affect the way that we see the characters. One of the ones in particular that I happen to remember, because it also references shapes and things like that, but she was talking about an anime character where he's got a blocky upper body, a more angular lower body, and then he has several angular repetitions throughout his character design, which that was a great point that a lot of people kind of like touched on. But the concept of repeating certain shapes throughout a character design, like, okay, you don't want your character to be completely the same shape. Everything about them doesn't have to be the same, because that was another point that I actually really liked, is the concept of taking different shapes and joining them together in order to make a character. So again, like you have your blocky top, your angular bottom, things like that. It gives your character a little bit more dimension, and it plays with the proportions. So in reference to this character though, on top of having like the repeating triangular shapes in his design, he also had a smaller, more slightly rounded, squared head, so it's like it gives you this depth of a character, and he's very realistic instead of being super cartoony, because that's definitely another avenue that I feel like I struggle with, is taking your style and applying proportions to it in terms of character design, because you want your characters to look, in whatever particular style you have, but if you have a more cartoony style, sometimes that suits the more abstract approach to character design in terms of proportion. And then, like, if you have a more realistic style, though, it feels like it's harder to bring in the more dramatized shapes and proportions of characters without making them look cartoony. that's definitely something I'm still working through. But all of that being said, I feel like these videos were great reference points, and honestly, if anybody else can provide any further information, I'm really still struggling with how to bridge that gap. As like you can see in the videos that I've clipped in, I've been trying to practice. I was going over the things that they taught. It's like I'm really curious how everybody else approaches character design, and I'm not sure if I'm just overthinking it, but I don't like where my character designs are currently. I just feel like it's basically gesture drawing. Yeah, I feel a little stuck. But those, again, are the 6 main points that I did notice in character design that everybody's been talking about in terms of all the videos that I watched. There are still so many more I have not watched yet, and I intend to, but this is only what I could do over a weekend. So I hope that this was helpful, and if you have any questions, any advice, go ahead and leave a comment. I will make sure to link all of the videos I referenced down below, and yeah, so let's keep creating. Until next time.